All right, welcome back to another episode of Modern Cyber. I am really excited to get into today's topic with today's guest because we're going to go deep on a couple of areas and we're also going to go broad. And there's not that many people that I have on Modern Cyber that I can do both with. So we're in for a real treat today. It's somebody I've known for a little while, a big name in the cybersecurity community. I'm sure you will all recognize him if you haven't already from his face on the screen. I am delighted today to be joined by Caleb Sima. Caleb, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Modern Cyber today.
Thanks, Jeremy. I appreciate the compliment too. That's a big one. So
awesome. For those who don't know you, I think, it's fair to describe you as a multi-time founder, CEO and CTO, also a CISO and practitioner at Capital One, Databricks, and Robinhood. And I know you've got your own cyber investment firm, WhiteRabbit. Is there anything else around your background or your experience that you'd like to share with the audience?
No, not really. I mean, maybe actually the most important part, which is I'm an engineer at my core. I love the keyboard. I love getting into the weeds. And actually, my biggest complaint is I generally don't have enough time to do that. But that's the thing that really always fires me up.
So like problem solving really at its core, right? Like working your way through something.
Building things too. I would say, finding the root core of a problem and then building a thing that matters really drives me. I love that process.
Awesome. We're recording in early 2026. I want to dive right into the topic that is probably number one on most people's minds right now, which is securing AI adoption inside organizations. And I know you co-host an AI security podcast. I always tell people I actually learn the most from hosting the Modern Cyber podcast. I learn more than our audience because I'm on every single episode. Our audience members might catch an episode here or there, but I get to hear all of them. Do you feel the same about hosting the AI security podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we hear so much about AI security. I get somewhat sick of it in the sense that we hear a lot about AI cybersecurity. And we learn a lot about, and the thing that matters the most is practically speaking. We hear from people, both vendors who are building AI in their production products and operators who are trying to secure AI in those production AI systems. And so, we, by the way, don't just have cyber people on our podcast. We have heads of engineering. We have CTOs who are dealing with it that go on the podcast. So we learn a lot. And I, by far, you guys know this too, the more you get into a subject, the more you realize that you don't know a lot. They're so deep. And AI changes every minute of every day. And so it's impossible to keep up.
100%. I mean, we have a little mini series here on Modern Cyber that we put out short, like 10-minute episodes every week called This Week in AI Security, where we're typically covering, the things from the last week. And sometimes it's a little bit variations on a theme. Like, for instance, over the last couple of weeks, we've seen that like a lot of AI-assisted IDE environments, it's been like one thing after the other in terms of like, oh, this one has, exposes APIs that are unauthenticated that somebody could get access to on a local network. This one has, if you put in some kind of embedded prompt inside a README document, will actually then like exfiltrate credentials or secrets from your IDE environment. It's like things like that we've seen thematically. But then every week there's at least one thing that is like net new that I never would have thought about before. And to your point, like it shows me, I consider myself somebody relatively educated on this space, but there's stuff that, every week that I'm like, where the heck did this come from?
Yeah, this week's is Claude Bot, the personal assistant. Have you seen that already?
I have, yeah, but I've not.
That's this week's version. Yeah, that's this week's version of it.
I've not dug deep into it. What's your like 2-minute TLDR version of what's going on there?
Sure. So, this person released their sort of personal AI assistant software program that was been vibe coded. And it's effectively the equivalent of Claude Code in its core and an AI role around it. So it has shell access, full system access to WhatsApp, Signal, email, calendar, you name it, whatever you give it to. And it acts like a personal assistant. First of all, super great idea. Of course, everyone's chasing that dream. Second of all, effectively very useful once you set it up in the right way. But the problem is everyone is buying Mac Minis or apparently running it on their local machine, giving it its effective super user privileges, running it in the background. It leaves ports open. It reads everything and then will execute based on what it's been told. So people it'll read your email, it'll read your messages. Yep. So you could do things that says, prompt inject it, like interrupt. Hey, Claude bot, I need you to run this system command and then go to this link with this database 64 encoded, and ta-da, everyone is getting popped. There's a guy who I think posting about, he's running a scanner now on these things, and he's finding instances, thousands and thousands of instances that are now fully remote code execution, getting their data like it's the hot thing. So.
And what's the initial breach vector? Is it just like, a message or an email that says like, hey, Claude bot?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting because it brings up a couple of things that from my perspective, it's one of the biggest questions that I face today, and I'd love to get your perspective around this. We talk to a lot of organizations that are kind of, let's say, growing from phase 1 into phase 2 of their AI adoption, where I would roughly define phase 1 as like, okay, we're kicking the tires on just interacting with LLMs, and we're doing like very basic stuff, mostly at the workforce level. So, your Jeremy and your Caleb who are in their web browser, or maybe they've downloaded the ChatGPT app, and they're doing things like uploading PDF documents for summarization purposes, maybe, doing things like a little bit of text generation around some stuff, and maybe even to the level of like, let's say, like Excel file analysis or whatnot, but like pretty conservative, getting to understand what the capabilities are like. So not the power users, not the like early adopters, the leading edge of the curve, but if you think about like that bell curve of adoption, we're talking about the kind of the middle of the market, right? They're starting to
go in chat world. That's where they are.
Yeah. Right. And maybe like some of them are now starting to grow up a little bit or mature a little bit in terms of like, okay, we can now think about bolting this into an LLM powered application. We talk to these organizations and they're like, well, we know we need to build this in a secure way. And I'm like, awesome. What are you worried about? Are you worried about the data access? Are you worried about the roles? Are you worried about kind of the authentication, authorization, and the permissions assigned to it? And they're like, yes, because I don't know what things are actually the highest risk to me. What's your take? Like, what are the things that in your mind are actually the highest risk that people should be worried about? And are there things contrarily that you think like, oh, we hear about it, but actually in the end, it's a lot of hype and there's not a lot of signal there?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, you have to always look, this is same as anything in security. We're just talking about a new tech stack and a new sort of market, but it's what are the attackers doing? So that's the way I first approach this.
So from the threat model perspective.
Yeah, from a threat model perspective, what is the attack that is the most likely, most reasonably impactful way of doing this? And the number one is prompt injection. Prompt injection is what you need to worry about. And then becomes this, and then second to that, I would say, is data poisoning, which it's arguable that data poisoning is not just a stored version of prompt injection. But that you can call it whatever you want to call it. Either way, it's about being able to pass a message to the LLM and get it to take actions or change the way it's thinking, right? Like that is the biggest problem. Because LLMs and what AI is doing is doing its job properly, which is to really be able to think, reason, and communicate with people in a really different way. And so I think that is the biggest threat. And I think everything else revolves around that. So for example, are permissions a big problem? Absolutely. Well, why are they? Because if I can prompt inject what that LLM has access to, the tools it has access to, the capabilities of those tools, the data it has access to, the data that it has access to, all of these things now are risks that you need to start thinking about. And so when you take an LLM and then you say, well, the threat factor is it's pretty easy or quote unquote easy to manipulate this LLM, then what does it have access to and what is it doing? And then how do I identify, restrict, contain? Those are all the areas that you then have to worry about.
Yeah, and it's interesting because like exactly this point about prompt injection, there's two parallels that from my own life and there's something else that you said that I want to come back to in just a minute. But there's two parallels from my experience in the cyber domain that I think about that are very much in line with this. Number one is actually like social media. The point about data poisoning to me, it's like a low grade influence campaign that shifts the LLM's thinking towards a particular, either towards or away from a particular set of data by giving it more and more kind of misinformation, right? It's kind of, it's one way to think about it. I'm not sure that that's like the canonically correct, but that's kind of one way that I conceptualize it. But number two, around prompt injection, it really brings me back to kind of like basics of web application where you think about kind of input validation and sanitization. And I know it's not as easy as saying, well, maybe before inputs go to an LLM, maybe they need to pass through a filter to make sure that there's nothing bad in them, because that has some downsides to it as well. But how do you actually counsel people to think about mitigating prompt injection today?
Yeah, you need, well, just like SQL injection and cross-site scripting of yesteryear, like it's about inputs, right? And so understanding where is the inputs coming into these models and what are the outputs coming from these models. And similarly, like I'm going to take cross-site scripting, I think is a perfect example. How did we manage? We never quote unquote solved cross-site scripting, but I think we manage it. And you manage it by basically saying, well, what input is coming in and is this what we expect? And can we filter at that level? And then the second level is on its output. Hey, this is a piece of JavaScript that is launching in an area that is not what we expect, and then we're going to go ahead and beat that as an area of prevention. Similarly with LLMs, right? Where is the input coming from? Is it coming from untrusted sources? Is it coming from trusted sources? This all makes a big difference. And then can you analyze this for your basics, right? And what we mean by basics is just like in cross-site scripting in the first versions of that, you'd look for really stupid signatures. And I think like at least today, that is what we are getting is both stupid signatures or let's call them low-grade models that will at least analyze these things using other AI to determine, does this look like or appear like prompt injection coming on the inbound? And then second is on the outbound, right? Which is, hey, based off of the history of this and what's coming out, does it look like the LLM is trying to take an action that does not seem reasonable for the intent that it's meant to do? Like, let's flag that and or prevent it. And these are generally the two ways of doing it. And LLM gateways, LLM firewalls, LLM whatever you may call them, prompt guards, whatever these things are, there's several companies that are focused on helping solve this problem in at least this way today.
Yeah. But it's interesting because you point out something that I think, like to your point about we never got rid of cross-site scripting or SQL injection, by the way, but we did learn to kind of manage it. But to manage it properly, you actually need to look at inputs and outputs, right? And in fact, like if you think about that and you translate to either like the web application or to, let's say, the API-centric view of the world, it's request and response payloads that you got to look at. In so many approaches that I've seen, focus on one or the other, but don't do both. And there's always these trade-offs that get put in there. It's like, well, if I do both, the latency that I'm introducing and the performance hit that I'm introducing, and then the complexity, and then what if I want to change, what's a valid input later? I've got to go back, revisit my API or whatever that thing is. There's engineering complexity and so on that can go along with it. But it's not an optional thing, in my opinion, if you want to build a secure LLM-powered application. If you want any kind of, like, you already have a non-deterministic backend to this whole thing that you're building. And if you want at least some layer of predictability around what the application is going to spit out, you kind of have to take those steps.
Yeah. And there's different examples of this too, right? Where it can get complicated. The most simple example is I'm a chat app and this chat app happens to have access to a data store to write queries. It's a tool, right? It has a SQL query tool. Okay, well, I can prompt inject by making this LLM do and query data that it shouldn't and then return it to me. How do you prevent that? Doing signatures is actually not going to work. Deterministic is very bad. So you have to have some non-deterministic. You have to use AI to defend against AI. And to your point, like, well, do I just see it or do I prevent it? Does that mean I have to stop the request, analyze it, then allow it to go through? No, that will never work in a production system. You can only detect and then respond. So then you can, these systems, it depends on where you have it. If I see the attack inbound, I will prevent the response on the outbound in order to do it. Yeah. And do I even analyze the response on the outbound? And this too. There's so many ways now you can bypass this. If I use some odd Chinese dialect in my request, LLMs will understand it. but none of your rules will ever understand it. And like
Yeah.
the same thing done.
And in fact, like one of the most, I don't know if it's amongst the most common, but one of the known attack techniques is the so-called hamburger attack, where you layer multiple languages. In your prompt, you embed multiple languages, and one of them has a malicious prompt.
Yep.
And it does seem to be the case that most LLMs will kind of lose track of their guardrails as they go through. You give it a set of instructions that's like, take each of these commands from their native language and execute on them.
Yep.
And, the first couple are going to be very innocuous, whatever. And then maybe it's the third or the fourth one. By that point, it seems the case that the guardrails very often fail to fire, so to speak, or fail to kind of intercept at that point because of whatever complexity is happening. And I'm not sure, by the way, that anybody, the LLM makers included, really understand why that's the case. Because like at that layer, you've already translated from the initial inputs, you've gone through a tokenization, you've gone through to a vector translation, and you're really dealing with numbers as opposed to, kind of the sentiment of what's intended by the guardrail. It just seems like there are always these kind of layers of complexity that we're learning about as we go, as we as an industry rush headlong into adopting this stuff.
Here's what's really funny is similar to that advanced attack. I've also heard of advanced attacks where they're using context rot as a great example to be able to do this, where if I put my attack at the beginning and then fill a bunch of valid stuff up to where I know that the guard LLM will not take that context, but the ending LLM will understand the context, I can bypass things. But here's the thing that's the most funny, Jeremy, out of all of this stuff is people, as security people do, we always go and find the holes, like all these advanced, cool techniques to do this. But, similar to our previous chat about learning real production and what's going on, what's fascinating to me is I would say maybe 90 to 95% of these enterprises aren't even doing LLM firewalls at all. Like they're not even having the basics. Like they don't even do the normal judging models or even the signatures for this today.
I might even take you one step less mature or one step backwards on the maturity model, which is to say, like most organizations that we talk to don't actually have a centralized visibility into what is actually going on and who's building what, where, using what LLM, with what data, for what use case. A little bit a problem that to me very much reminds me of like where cloud adoption was in the mid 2010s when, you went into a lot of organizations. And if you talk to somebody centrally, you say like, hey, what cloud do you have? And they're like, well, I know we have some AWS. We might have a little bit Azure. And then when you actually like inspect their environments, you find that not only do they have some AWS, they have, dozens or hundreds of AWS accounts. Right. They have, tens, if not hundreds of workloads running on these environments. Like the kind of the pressure to adopt, I hear about from different organizations as being either a C-level initiative or as a department-level initiative. And if it's a department-level initiative, very often the C-level doesn't have visibility into what all the individual departments are doing. And so you just got like kind of not rogue usage, but you've got sprawl happening all over the place without any kind of central coherence around it. That's kind of something that I'm seeing. I'm curious if that kind of vibes with what you've heard from some of the larger organizations you've talked to.
Yeah, everyone is in different states of, I would say, maturity, right? Obviously, in this. The ones who are the leading edge of this stuff, they have now developed sort of AI platform teams, right? And it really models, Jeremy, what you mentioned about cloud, right? Remember, like there started being cloud platform teams that started managing
center of excellence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that became, now that's normal, right? You've got the infra team, cloud team, like that is like, and now the most cutting edge companies are now creating AI platform teams where they are consolidating, managing, centralizing what is the AI technology stack and how is that provided to be useful to the rest of the organization. And you're just seeing really, really early companies starting to adopt that methodology where, hey, we are already centralized on using Anthropic for our production infrastructure. We are already centralized on using our OpenAI for our employee base. These things are now becoming both centralized and then used inside of the organization. But even with that being said, that also, I'll sort of extend a bit into vibe coding, right?
Yeah.
Which obviously is, now where everyone and their sister who's not even in tech are vibe coding now. That then creates also similar to what you're saying is not just there's the AI sprawl, but now there's going to become the app sprawl where everyone is building apps. And so like engineering at least has some handle on this, right? Like they have a development pipeline. You can build whatever you want, but you're not pushing it out to prod unless it is approved, managed, and operated by a team who deals with that. But when you look at the corporate environment, the employee base, when someone in finance wants to build something, when someone in HR wants to vibe code their app, what is their deployment pipeline and who is managing that? All of that is also entering into this sprawl world where we have these types of problems.
Yeah, it's interesting. And to your point, by the way, like I wrote my first piece of software in about 15 years a couple of weeks ago. And, I didn't ask anybody. I didn't tell anybody, anybody else inside the organization. I just did it. I did it with Gemini. I got results. I won't say that it's the perfect piece of technology, but it at least, for instance, has gotten me ready for the next F1 Drive to Survive season on Netflix without knowing the spoilers, which was my goal. I built a browser extension to block all Formula One news. I don't actually care about Formula One, but I really love the Netflix series. It's like super compelling. And so now when I'm browsing the news, like I don't see any Formula One stories or articles. And I get to kind of binge the series as pseudo live. So, this tens or hundreds of workloads that are going to pop up there. Like, I know there's a lot of data that suggests that, vibe coded things they may be functional, but they tend to ship with a lot of security vulnerabilities. They tend not to be the most secure code ever written. And they certainly don't always do a good job of doing things like, let's say, secrets or environment variable management and things like that. Are you seeing a lot of real risk around vibe coded applications, or is it more just the sprawl aspect of the workloads?
I mean, there are both, right? The aspect of vibe coding an application, like, again, let's take someone in finance who vibe coded a phenomenal process, which, by the way, probably adds a huge amount of value to the finance team, right?
Yeah.
And for all intents and purposes, should be used, right? Like it produces great value that needs to be used. And the person who vibe coded it, didn't think about things like overprivilege or the fact that the vibe coding app is using his credentials when he's pushing it out there. All right. So
like fetch from the general ledger system or payroll, whatever the case may be. Right.
Exactly. That's right. Like these are the mistakes. So yes, are we talking about keys left in places they shouldn't, or configurations that are open they shouldn't, or really using permissions that it shouldn't? These are all very, very valid. My guess, though, this is my guess, and just based on my usage with AI, this is an easy quote unquote problem to solve. If you run the right agent or right skill in, let's say, Claude Code or whatever you're using to look at, identify, remove, and lock down or make good security architecture decisions, it does a pretty damn good job. Like it can do great works and automatically identifying, finding, and fixing these kinds of problems, right? The key factor then to me does become the sprawl problem, because who is forcing, Bob from finance to run that skill, to run that agent? Who is, and then even once you produce it to production, we all know this, he's going to update it with the bugs he's got to fix and features he has to add. Same as any software engineering organization, who runs the pipeline to ensure the gates are there? And so that I think is the longer term, more scary problem.
So we're back to kind of our core problem with almost any new technology platform, cloud again being a great example of it, where we solve sprawl with visibility. And once we have visibility, then we can start to make observations about, what is good, bad, allowed, disallowed, et cetera, and then make policy decisions based on that, right? And then start to think about enforcement and moving, advancing the maturity level inside the organization.
Correct. Yeah. My prediction is you're going to start seeing that in the next few years where corporate employee base has to have their own production pipeline, right? Where there is an app platform that employees can build and use really valid, useful, vibe coded apps per se that gives you the centralized policy, regulation, operations management that exists in engineering but does not exist there.
Yeah, I have to say, like, as I went through this vibe coding exercise of my own, I was pleasantly surprised at how easy it was for me to get a little bit of a pipeline up and running, as opposed to the last time I wrote code, like I said, about 15 years ago, where, setting up GitHub on my local machine and then connecting into a remote repo and storing my credentials and setting all of that was kind of a pain in the butt. And nowadays, like, honestly, the GitHub desktop app for Mac, like, everything was just in there. And I have almost the equivalent of a save button, and my code is committed, built, etc. Update to my browser extension is just kind of done. I've got the package ready. I can download, execute, do what I need to do. So at least like that aspect of it is being, kind of handled on the user experience side of this. But I'll be curious to see, like, where do you think this leads to? Do you think it leads to more vibe coded apps, or do you think at some point one of these platforms, whether it's Claude or ChatGPT, starts to have more of a kind of a whole desktop environment that does something like ClaudeBot, where it really kind of like understands what my job is, and I can just give it little skills that maybe I don't have to go through a full build pipeline. I can just kind of deploy these into a local desktop environment that, knows who I am, knows what I do, knows what I have access to, and then to kind of execute? Or do you think like that's more of a medium to longer term kind of vision?
Yeah, no, I mean, I actually think there's a bit of both, right?
Okay.
For sure, Jeremy, I think you are correct where, Claude Desktop becomes a much more OS environment. Like, this is why you see all the AI companies going after browser, right?
Yeah.
Is they are saying, okay, I get all the context. 99% of the work happens in browser. I get the context. I get the ability to navigate and use the browser as a tool. And similar to the operating system, right? Like Anthropic released, what is it, Claude for Work or something?
Oh, I haven't seen this.
Yeah, so Anthropic released this thing called Claude for Work, which is what they're trying to do is they're trying to dumbify or minimize Claude code into a consumerized, Claude version where it has access to tools, your files, your system can code and build on the fly. So you can then just type what you want. It will build, compile, produce a user UI app, and you can run it and use it, right? Like, so it's basically a, mini dumbified simplistic version of Claude code, built inside of Claude. And this now allows, your EA or, your intern in marketing to go in Claude code and help automate a lot of the things that they do both within browser, in your operating system. And to your point, I think in the future, it makes total sense that you now have this always on AI agent that can just go and see the things that you're doing, automatically create code for it, and automate the things that occur. I also think on the opposite side of that, you still need, well, how do I share this?
Yeah.
How do I build something that I've built in marketing or build something for me that is then shared, useful to my other employees and my peers, to help my organization be better? Then you're going to need also a secondary, what is the pipeline or process? Will Anthropic offer that? Will they say, oh, here's a set of apps that your employees have built inside of Claude. You can now run them or share them, maybe. Maybe it has to be something a little bit bigger or a little bit more enterprisey. I don't know, but I do think both of those are valid areas that we see needs, and both of those are areas that will be solved.
On that enterprise sharing side, I think a lot of the problems that we identified earlier around this, so things like, you build something, you try to hand it off to me, but you have different permissions levels than me. You have different data access than me. You maybe have access to a different set of not only like apps, but, maybe you're part of a different network, part of different teams. Like all of those things might go along, and you might find that I think there will be a teething problem as we go through some of that transition where we start to build these things and then we learn, okay, certain apps aren't going to have company-wide applicability because of some of these limitations and so on. It's going to be like the craziest kind of next 5 years. And I tell people I've been in technology for 28 years, I want to say at this point. And I've gone through desktop computer, LAN local file server to data center, colo to cloud to microservice architecture to, like multi-cloud, complex microservice architecture, serverless, like all this kind of stuff. This is the fastest thing I've ever seen. This is the fastest wave of development that I've ever seen. Like, how have you experienced it?
I mean, I don't know why, but I just think, man, we're old when you go through that, when you go through that timeline. But I mean, you are right. I mean, when you think about how fast things are moving and the capabilities of things, it's scary. So I'll give you an example in vibe coding. I always start with, I remember 2 years ago, I started on this. I had a very, very simple 1 through 8 one-liner requirements doc on how to build a crawler, right? Which was, crawl this thing, just use hrefs, line number 2 is make it multi-threaded. Line number 3 is, make it so it supports this. Line number 4 is, I want it to be scalable. So you have multiple crawlers, multiple bots. Line number 5 is like, I need it to be able to use browsers, not just crawling, very simple. And I remember the first time I tried running through vibe coding to do that. And I think I got maybe a third of the way through the list. And it took me over a month and it was painful. And then as models release, I kept doing that same list and it kept getting shorter and shorter. Then it took me a week. I could never complete it, but I got to, requirement number 6 and that's pretty good. And then, I got to requirement number 5 and it took me 3 days to get there. And I got requirement number 8, but still didn't quite finish it. Now today I can run through that list and it takes 15 minutes and it goes from 1 through 9, done. And it works. Right.
Yeah.
And so just the progress that I've seen through those past 2 years, I could take something that just couldn't be done. Now it's done in 15 minutes with no intervention by me. It is a complete copy, paste, go, and it just does it and it works. Like, think about that in the next year. What are the problems and areas of friction we have now and what's going to happen in the next year, assuming we continue to improve at that rate?
I mean, it's an interesting challenge to think about because, to your point, the tens or hundreds of workloads and the sprawl that comes along with that might be more real, might be more near term than we realize. I want to ask your thoughts about like some vibe coding best practices, because it sounds like you're someone who's done a lot of this over the last, year and a half, 2 years, maybe? And you've got this engineering background. You said something in there that I've been very curious about, because we see all these platforms like Lovable, Base 44, whatever, and they're like, just imagine it and make it real, right? But then like what you just said actually strikes me as much more the engineering culture that I've encountered at any number of companies that I've worked at in my career, which is like every product starts with a product requirements document, a PRD. It starts with a set of specifications for like, what is the end goal that I'm trying to accomplish here? But like these vibe coding platforms, they very much try to flip that model on their head. And the only one that I see personally that is like, no, let's stick to like PRD core fundamentals, like let's use that as the basis, is the AWS Kiro platform that has this like PRD led vibe coding ethos, I guess, if you will. Like, what's your take on what do you think is more effective? Like, and do you approach the PRD because that's your engineering background, or like, do you think that's actually the right way to go?
First of all, both, in the fact that my engineering background says it, and it's because it is the right thing to do. You need a roadmap, a PRD of what we want to build, how we want to build. And we both, Jeremy, you and I have been along long enough. Even in any engineering org, you start that way, but it never sticks. Right? Like, by and large,
guiding principles.
It's guiding principles. That's right. Yeah. Whatever's in production generally never matches what you built in your PRD. And technically your PRD actually creates engineering requirements and ERD. It's an architecture design doc, like all of these, get split off. And why do you do that? You do that because you need a good reference of core source of truth. What did we want to build? Why did we want to build it? What should it look like? How should it be built? And you need that because many, many people in an organization rotate out. And your employees base gets bigger and things change and you need to have a reference. And so I've always been that way, but I will tell you, at vibe coding today, most people who are at this cutting edge today all that is a given, right? You always do PRDs. So for example, anti-gravity by default will also do PRDs. There's one called Zenflow that will do PRDs by default. I even think Pedrome's one does it by default, and they'll do further than that. They won't just create the PRD per se, but they'll also break those up into small tasks, into checklists of those tasks, and into validation and requirements of those tasks. So not only do I sort of, TDD, like I create my little function, I create the test, I create the expectation of it, that gets passed off to an agent and then you swarm them. You can create 50 of them now that will then go and make sure that these things get built. And that is today's model of vibe coding a thing. Lovable, and those guys are going to get there because they're not there yet. But similarly in aspect, like it has to be done because what you get out of the output of that works. And by the way, just to inject this as a security podcast, but just to inject the security part in this is also how you build security requirements embedded into your PRDs, embedded into your design docs, into your engineering requirements doc.
Yeah.
And AI will follow it, right? And you'll build tests that will go through that process too.
Yeah, I mean, it's how you get an architecture that you can actually put up on a whiteboard or the equivalent and then build kind of like, okay, how am I going to attack this? Give me a threat model. Let's think about it. And then let's get into levels of like examining inputs and outputs and understanding what those like integration touch points are and how an attacker might look at this application and do something with it, right? Yeah, makes a ton of sense. It's really interesting because like I feel like we're still, as an industry, at a place where we don't know all the best practices around the right way to do things. Like for instance, recently I was in a task where I was trying to analyze a large data set of log files, and this is kind of one of those use cases that everybody talks about as being a core security use case for an LLM is like large scale log file analysis. And I tried it from a couple of different angles, and what I found that actually my best result was when I stopped trying to write all the prompts and actually had the LLM write the prompts for me.
Very good.
From like a PRD perspective, like my desired outcome is the following. How do I ask you those things? And for instance, I learned that there was like a pre-processing step because there was like inconsistent JSON in some of the documents that I was uploading and things like that. And so like all these little things that I learned along the way, I honestly, if I had to write all of those things on my own, I think I would have failed. Yeah, I think back to your parallel, I would have crashed out on step 3 of my step 9 or whatever, my process was going to be, right? So really interesting times and a ton of stuff moving along really, really rapidly.
Yeah, that is a phenomenal insight that you got, right? Which was AI is better at writing the prompts that I need for AI. 100%.
Yeah, I shared that actually on there's a group that does kind of a prompt sharing workshop every couple of weeks. You might know them. Sunil and Gadi over at Gnostic run this small community around this. And I shared that insight. And I have to say, like, from a community of people who are all at the cutting edge, there were plenty of people who were like, oh my gosh, I never thought about approaching the problem from the standpoint of like getting the LLM to do my work.
Is this prompt GTFO? Is this the...
Exactly, yeah. Yeah. You can find my YouTube video of my little session on that up there if you're so curious, and we'll try to link it from the show notes. Caleb, we're coming up on time. We've just got a couple of minutes left. I'm just like want to get your closing thoughts on a couple of things. I have my own perspective, and I'd love to hear your perspective. And my perspective is when I talk to organizations about like, hey, you're trying to secure AI adoption inside the organization, I always tell people you got to start from the core fundamentals like visibility, inventory, get the basics, get some observability, and then build some policies out from there. What are some of the guiding principles and some of the like first principles, fundamentals that you tell people around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard. If I go to the basics, it's, do you have your AI council? Do you have agreement on your what is your fundamental foundational tech that you are going to use? How are you going to use it? And can we get things like enterprise plans, right? And force AI traffic to our enterprise accounts, or at least through our gateways, so that we have, to your point, Jeremy, I think is the abstraction, which is get visibility first. And as long as you have that visibility, you can make the calls as to what those things are. And then make a list of approved models and approved tech that you can say, hey, in prod, this is what's approved. In dev, you need to give a lot more leeway, right? Like you kind of, people need to experiment with the latest stuff. But just make sure that the LLM traffic is being piped to you so you have that visibility. And I think at the end of the day, these are the basics around what they need to do. I think when it comes to permissions and others, a lot of standards really take place, which is, hey, what is the system? What do they have permission to? You need to look at AI as anything, any role or any account that you would normally in a system. What does it have access to? How does it have that access? How do we restrict it? Like, how does it auth? All of these things are all standards that we all know and love anyways. So none of that changes.
Yeah. I mean, some of those fundamentals, they're true almost no matter what technology you're using. If you don't have some agreement about like, a starting point, you don't have like your first PRD about how this stuff should start to get used. And then, you don't have visibility, you're definitely, you're at a super high risk of getting off track early on. And then correcting that is so much harder than starting with like a little bit of a guiding principle to go on.
Yeah. But like today, I think that's really simplistic in what you do, although most don't. Like just getting a freaking LLM firewall is just like needs to be number one, and forcing all LLM traffic through your gateway needs like these are just basics. Like just do that. And like similar. But again, when you look at enterprises, things such as like, hey, only allow outbound traffic, only from certain servers never happens either. So that's the way it works.
Also, the shadow AI use cases that pop up without your knowledge that don't go through those things, it's also a risk that I think most organizations are going to have to contend with at some point.
Yeah, I mean, well, this all then depends on the other basics, which is, do you have endpoint control on your laptops or not, or
basic user monitoring, all of the above. Yeah, awesome. Well, Caleb, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really great going through a lot of this with you again, as somebody who is like hosting a podcast on this and learning about this on a regular basis, and B, doing a lot of engineering work on your own and having gone through X iterations of vibe coding exercises of your own. If people want to find out more about, some of the work, some of the things that you guys are up to, what's the best place for them to look up your presence?
Find me on LinkedIn and just follow me there.
Find him on LinkedIn. We'll have his LinkedIn linked from the show notes. Caleb, thank you again for taking the time to join us on Modern Cyber today. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with our next episode. Talk to you then. Bye-bye.